Well, hello there, and welcome back to another ramble. I'm Corny Swiss,
I'm Corny Phil.
and today we'll be tackling the subject of perceived Russian bias. Is it a thing? Is it not? Why do people think so? Why do we think whatever we think? And such things. So, I guess we'll start with a discussion on what exactly is Russian bias. And Russian bias, fundamentally, is the idea that because the companies that make our favorite games, like World of Tanks, World of Warships, War Thunder. Basically, I'm talking about Wargaming and Gaijin, both of which are basically Russian companies. So, there is a perception that Russian machines, be it planes or tanks, and I mean, when we see Russian ships, we can talk about Russian ships, but planes and tanks in particular, the Russian ones tend to be much better, tend to be lower tier, tend to have, they usually get into the game first, all kinds of, I guess, preferential treatment. And a lot of times, especially in War Thunder's case, in the early stages of ground forces, Russian tanks basically just dominated everybody. For a variety of reasons, but that led to the kind of crossover of the Russian bias idea from World of Tanks into War Thunder. And it's prevalent in World of Tanks, and some of the evidence people point to is that if you look at both games, which nation has the most high-rank vehicles? Well, the Russians do. They have plenty of tier 10s in World of Tanks, and there's, I believe, high-ranked, 6 or 7 high-ranked Russian ground vehicles in War Thunder. Now, I can't speak much to the plane side of things because I've only made it about to middle tiers of Russian planes, but they generally get big cannons, lots of 20 millimeters. Even though they don't have much ammo, those 20 millimeters just shred everybody. So, that leads to calls of Russian bias. So that's basically what Russian bias is. The question we want to tackle in this video is Russian bias a thing? And if it is or isn't, why do people think it is or isn't? And what's, I guess, our logic and reasoning for our opinion? So, would you like me to start, Phil, or would you like to give your thoughts?
Let's let you lead off. You've already done a good job so far.
Okay, approval. So, in terms of Russian
Motion
bias, I'm of the opinion that Russian bias is not a thing. I do not think Russian bias is a conscious... I don't think the idea to have Russian machines be better than other machines is a conscious decision by the developers. I instead think that it is a direct it's a direct outcome of the style of, I guess the style of the games they're represented in. You have things like World of Tanks, which is an arcade-style tank game. What do you need in an arcade-style tank game? Well, in both tank games, really. Ideally, you want sloped armor. Ideally, you want speed over everything else. You want a good gun, and you want effective armor. A lot of times, this armor, to be effective, needs to be sloped. The flat armor is just not good. That's why high-tier Russian machines, like the King Tigers, have such a mixed opinion on them. The Tiger 2H is a very strong tank. The issue it runs into is that the face of its turret is the most prevalent place to shoot it with large caliber Russian guns and any caliber American gun. And that's just because even though that's the thickest armor on the tank, it's not thick enough. Right, and it's flat surface. The upper glacis is angled back and is thinner, but people don't shoot there generally, unless they're firing like heat rounds or something like that, which I'll backtrack. A lot of mid-tier Russian machines and American machines don't really have those heat shells yet. They have APCR and things like that, but the upper glacis is still plenty effective. So they go for the turret face, which isn't thick enough to stop those rounds just based on raw thickness, which is all it has. When you add sloped armor into the mix, now you have chances for weird bounces, for lucky moments, things like that. And when you look at Russian tank design, it is almost entirely sloped armor, thick enough armor to reach a certain tipping point, but it's all heavily sloped. It's angled. It's weird. The turret faces are generally as small as they can be, while still fitting the breech of the gun, because your turret face is always going to be somewhat, flat, because you do have to fit the gun on there. But you can make it small, and you can make it pretty small.
Yeah.
So,
And sorry.
Ahead. No, you go ahead.
Were you finished?
Basically.
Okay, and just you kind of echo you a little bit. I agree as well that the Russian bias is very much a perceived thing rather than a reality. And I can certainly understand, I want to break off a small piece of the Russian bias and say, are the Russians getting a few more development cycles in terms of like, hey, there's more Russian tanks than there are American tanks or German tanks? I mean, maybe, but just being kind of intellectually honest, if it was an American company designing the tanks, it's likely the Americans would be the most fleshed out, or would be more fleshed out faster, because there is always going to be some hint of patriotism, or call it nationalism in terms of that. So I think there's some very small grain of truth to the idea that the primarily Russian game designers are going to put in their country's tanks. But that doesn't change the fact that the tanks are not. There's no intentional bias of, we got to make the Russian tanks strong because that demonstrates, glory for the motherland. That's not really what they're about here. Instead, we've got to look at like the design philosophies, the histories. You've already kind of alluded to the design philosophies of, very heavy, very heavily sloped armor, very low profile, fast, aggressive tanks with, not the thickest armor on the planet, but more than sloped enough to reach those critical breakpoints, and while maybe not totally immortal, because we now, like with the Leopard 1, we are seeing tanks that anybody can be penned by anybody, but you're at least getting to the point where these tanks are pretty tough cookies to crack. But I want to point out just one thing in particular, more focused on the Americans versus Russians, because I feel like the Germans suffered from that whole not winning World War II thing. That kind of put a wheel in the spokes, or a stick in the spokes of their development. But if you look at geography, Russia is a huge landmass connected to the rest of Asia and Europe. Most, if not all, of Russia's fighting is going to be on the ground, treads on the road kind of fighting. So of course they're going to spend a lot of time developing tanks, a lot of tank philosophy, a lot of design dollars. R&D expenses are going to go into that because they need to, because that's where their wars are going to be fought. When you flip over to the US, unless something's gone very, very wrong for the US, we're never going to be fighting a war on our own soil, which means that. And what happened is we spent a lot of time rebuilding the Pacific Fleet, expanding our naval influence and our Air Force, because the U.S.'s more or less position dictates that we need to be able to control the seas, because that's our walls, so to speak, to defend ourselves, and Air Force to bring about superiority in the air, and thus our homeland is essentially protected. And we only go to fight boots on the ground when we actually want to. And that's always with air and naval support.
Yeah. And to further elaborate, I guess, when you look at historically, particularly during World War II, tank design philosophy, for, I'll say I won't talk about the British, because they had they might be the subject of a video that's more focused on them. It might be a topic that's might be more easily visited once we see British tanks in War Thunder. But as it stands, I'll talk about the Americans and the Russians, because they're the easiest comparisons to draw. American tank philosophy was, this is basically our cavalry. We had cavalry during all the previous wars and World War I to some degree, but we don't use horses anymore. So we'll just make armored machines that fill that role. So American tanks, you have kind of the tank destroyers and the regular tanks. Those regular tanks were supposed to support infantry And when the infantry and air power were able to create openings in the enemy lines, you had the tanks bolting through there, pushing that gap and pushing the issue, and basically running rampant through the enemy's rear. So the whole goal there was to just exploit breaches created by infantry and air power and the other branches of the services. So that led to American tanks being focused on, okay, well, the guns need to have a decent HE shell. So we need, like, you know, shorter barreled, more in line with howitzers type guns. And then the tank destroyers are designed to destroy tanks. So they have longer barreled, high velocity ammunitions, you know, things like that to knock out tanks. So American tanks as a whole are reliable. They get a lot of tread on those, well, you get a lot of tread out of them. And they're generally just, if a turret gets blown off one, they put a new turret on it, they send it right back out. That idea is similar with the Russians, but the use of the tanks themselves was entirely different. You don't really have, you have tank destroyers, but they don't really operate in the same way that American tank destroyers did. American tank destroyers were basically hunting packs, whereas Russian tank destroyers were more like a second line support to the main assault, which is led by T-34s and things like that. A Russian tank's job was to go forward, was to be the main attacking force with infantry support to keep their flanks clear as they pushed forward. It wasn't, and if you can't use tanks, you just send in the infantry, but you see it all throughout the war on the Eastern Front, where T-34s were leading the way, things like that. And they were designed to charge forward, to take advantage of sloped armor, to increase speed. And they had good enough guns, but not great guns, because, I mean, we are talking about the Soviet Union. And then you have things like Su-152s. You have larger caliber, basically mobile howitzers and tank destroyers in the back to support and kind of go where they need to be. So they have the same sort. They have some tank destroyer units had like a wolf pack mentality, but they're generally just a second line, following behind the main advance to knock out tanks in tough spots as needed. You had the term, you know, assault guns. Su-152 is a prime example. It's not meant to lead the charge, but it's meant to blast away fortifications that are being stubborn. It's not really meant to face tanks. It can, but it really isn't supposed to. So
and then, like, in reference to like the Su-152 as an example, or the 152 variants, like they were definitely not intended to shoot tanks. It just so happens that when you put a shell that freaking big into a tank, it generally breaks everything.
It just blows up.
Of course it does. Yeah.
Yeah. But to continue the point, you have one philosophy of tank, primarily the Allied. I say Allied. I mean, Soviet Union was an ally, but the Western ideology, which is these tanks are meant to support. They're not meant to charge forward. They're not meant to be our main attacking force. They're meant to exploit the breakthroughs that the other services are able to generate. The Russian philosophy is different. The Russian tanks need to be leading the charge. These are, it's more of the World War I philosophy, where this tank is impervious to small arms fire. Our infantry are not impervious to small arms fire because they're not filled with enough vodka. So we're going to send the tanks forward. They're going to take all the hits, all the machine gun fire and all things like that, and then the infantry are going to use them as cover and get across that ground and dig out the enemy emplacements, right? So when you have these two different philosophies, one lends itself better to tank games. Primarily the Russian style, where these are tanks that are supposed to be fast, they have effective armor, and their armor is kind of geared towards being on the offensive, being able to move and change your angling of your hull and things like that to take advantage of lucky bounces, weird ricochets, things like that. So you have a situation where a lot of times I think the way you succeed in games like World of Tanks in particular is to be aggressive as a unit and just take the fight to them right away. In War Thunder there's a little bit more finesse because of how easy it is to one-shot tanks. A tank with a decent rate of fire could wipe out an entire team through the course of one charge. In World of Tanks, it just doesn't happen. But regardless, you have tanks with good caliber guns, pretty decent armor to good armor, and they're fast. So that's, I've said in previous videos, and I've said it a few times now, if I had to, you have three things that go into a tank. You have the gun, the speed, and the armor. Well, two of those are mutually exclusive. Speed and armor, you can't have both. You just really can't. The gun is on its own place, and if you have a good gun, I would rather have more speed than armor, because armor really doesn't get you that far. Because if you're not fast, you can't take advantage of the enemy team's mistakes, you can't flank, you can't do a lot of things, and then you get limited, right? So that's kind of the issue that some of the later tier German machines run into. Less so with the Americans, but the American tanks really don't have armor at those tiers. So that's why for the longest time before we had American tanks, you saw Russian teams just absolutely curb stomping German teams. But that was because the design philosophy for the German tanks was to be more defensive. And they have thicker armor, but that armor isn't sloped, except for the Panthers, really. And then when you finally get to the Tiger IIs, the Russians just have big guns,
Yeah.
And those big guns, the thing is that there's a lot of tanks in the game that can penetrate the gun mantlet, the turret face of a Tiger II. Just because even though it's the thickest armor on the tank, it's not that thick, right? And it's perfectly flat. So you're not giving yourself there's no leeway there. If the shell strikes it, it's going to penetrate. If it's sloped, and weird, kind of like the front of a T-34 or the front of a T-54, you get those chances that the shell is going to not catch the armor right and is going to bounce. Happens all the time, So, yeah, that's kind of my, I guess, long-winded explanation for why I really don't think Russian bias is a thing. I think it's, if you want to expand and look for where this thought comes from, it's primarily from the fact that these Russian tanks generally dominate games, and there's a lot of good, and partly because there are just some good Russian tanks, but
it turns out they were good at designing tanks.
They have good tanks.
Of life.
And then the game modes themselves, like Capture the Flag, that's an offensive game mode. It's just innately offensive, where you need to take a position, and then to win, you have to push the enemy completely off the map. You can't just sit in that position and hold your ground and try and defend, because you have things like in War Thunder, it's especially hard because there's planes, you can get bombed, you can get artillery called on you. In World of Tanks, artillery can be called on you, or can shoot you. And there's just less... World of Tanks as a whole needs to be more offensive. War Thunder, there is more defensive elements in it, but it is definitely a game where, in a conquest mode, you take the zone, you continue to push. You push the enemy clean off the map, right? And then when you go to like a battle game mode, where it's more like the World of Tanks style, where it's, team against team, you each have a zone, you generally don't win by capping, you generally win by killing everybody. Well, that's also offensive. That's, you have to kill other people. You have to kill other tanks. It's, so you have to be aggressive, and if your team forms a little unit and attacks, you generally get away with it. You generally are successful if you have to attack specific ground. But then, like I said, you can't stay there. You have to keep pushing, and you just drive the enemy off the map.
Yeah, and I think there's a metaphor or a connection to be made here between games and first-person shooters. Because I think most people have probably played Call of Duty or Titanfall or Battlefield or some variant thereof. Russian tanks, as a general rule, are the guys running around with submachine guns, maybe assault rifles. Big, not necessarily the biggest, well, in the Russians' case, they do have the biggest guns, but they're running around with fast-moving people looking to get in up close and personal and blow you away with superior firepower. Talk about the German tanks. They're primarily snipers. They got nice, high-penetration guns, very nice guns. But they're not intended to get up and close and personal. That's the reason the Leopard is doing so much for the metagame, I think. Or at least that's the perception, is because the Leopard is, the dude running around with a submachine gun, and he's capable of protecting the snipers. or at least giving the snipers some ability to stand off from getting into knife
Yeah, you
fight
can get
range
on the
with.
flank, secure the flank,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then counterflank, basically.
Yeah, because and I think in most first-person shooters, I mean, the sniper can usually get a kill or two, but it's going to get quickly overwhelmed. And it's the same in World of Tanks or in War Thunder. The high damage, low defense, low mobility, or these high damage, low mobility tanks just get they might get a kill, but they'll just get run over by these high mobility, high damage, counter or
What? And
counterattacks.
it's not even that. It's more so that mobility. I would say, especially in terms of War Thunder and World Tanks, it's not that the mobility is bad. I mean, it's just the thing is it's average, all right. And when you're average, people who are above average are going to exploit that,
Yeah,
right? And so it's, I guess maybe just to correct something you said, or maybe just clarify
go ahead.
the top. If you look at top speeds, they're all basically the same. Generally, the Russian tanks have a higher top speed. Generally, the American tanks have a little bit higher top speed than the German tanks. Whatever. The top speed kind of isn't what's important because most tanks don't reach their top speed. The Leopard doesn't get anywhere near its top speed. The difference is the grunt and the engine and the fact that it can accelerate so quickly to a middle ground speed. German tanks don't do that very well, generally. There are exceptions. Russian tanks do it pretty well, you know. So I like that analogy that they're the kids with the submachine guns running around wasting people because that's kind of accurate. That's what, like, you look at the best example would be like a T-50, right? The T-50 of the olden days when it had almost impervious armor primarily because it was moving so fast and you couldn't hit the damn thing square, you know? And then it has
And of
this
course,
quick firing gun.
it initially had a crap ton of armor too. But
Well, it has the same armor, it's just been up-tiered since it's not as
yeah,
glorious
exactly.
anymore. But the point is, a T-50 can destroy a Tiger. We all saw the Oxide video where you may not have seen it, Phil, but
I haven't, but I'll
well,
go
he
along with
basically
it.
ran around in a T-50 for a bunch of high-tier games and killed Tigers because
Awesome.
T-50's APCR ammo I think has like 100 millimeters penetration. Tiger's side is only 80, so he would just run
Yeah.
up next to him, get under their gun, and just pound their ammo rack.
One
So
way to do it.
I don't know if it'll work anymore. It might still. It was a while ago, but the point stands that that's a 100% good way of putting it, and I don't. But I guess to bring back to the original point, I don't see it as being Russian bias. I think it's an easy kind of scapegoat to say sometimes when you hit the front plate of a T-34 with a shell that should have penetrated but didn't. And a
Yeah.
lot of times I feel like the game doesn't do, even if it, I don't know, sometimes the game doesn't show the proper, basically the shell didn't penetrate because one, maybe RNG is a part of the game. I'm speaking of War Thunder here. Maybe something
Jesus,
happened.
please.
Maybe something happened. Like, just all kinds of things can happen where that shell didn't penetrate. And when you have enough, like a T-54 with enough armor on the front plate that's sloped back, and if you don't hit him, if he's not going directly at you, there's always going to be a chance for a bounce when you're firing AP ammo and things like that. So, yeah, Russian bias. I don't really buy it. I think it's,
Don't buy the bias.
yeah, I think it's very much so kind of a scapegoat, something we can point to.
Yeah, and
Because
I
it's
definitely
easy.
I definitely agree on that. And I mean, and I can sympathize and understand because I think everybody's played games where they're like, oh, it's just, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just getting punished by, the bullshit. But
Yeah.
when I'm being honest with myself, the truth is it's not that I'm getting punished by the nonsense or the bullshit. It's that I didn't play well or or something happened that, I could have foreseen. But,
Well, yeah, and
it's
I've told you, I've told myself many times. I think I've told other people. A lot of times, the difference between winning and losing is decisions that either you make or your team makes. But a lot of times, it comes down to your involvement. And I'm speaking
yeah,
generally, where to win you had to do something. Maybe you didn't know what that was, or maybe it was impossible. You just couldn't do it. Like you needed to ammo rack 6 tanks at once with one shell.
Yeah, we've
You
we've
know?
had a couple of games in World of Warships that are like that, where it's like, oh, if the next 6 guys I see, I blow up their magazine on the first shot, we'll win.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I mean,
And
that's not happening.
sometimes you have to look back to find where the critical flaw was. Because every game is winnable. There's especially in World of Tanks War Thunder, I think every game is winnable. It absolutely is. You see all those videos and all those things about people with like a game. You go into a match of War Thunder, or World of Tanks rather, XVM tells you, oh, you have a 9% chance to win, and you pull it off.
Yeah,
It's because enough of your team members, you yourself included, made the correct decisions to win the game. And you never know what those correct decisions are. Sometimes it's sticking with the team even though they're all lemon training. Sometimes it's cutting off on your own even though the rest of the team's going a different way. So a lot of times I think
yeah. And I mean, to be honest, just as a side note, not that this really has a great deal of bearing on this, I've never fully subscribed to XVM as a reliable tool to
no,
indicate
I don't either.
anything. Like, I mean, because like you get like you have a 9% chance of winning. Like 9% based on what? On statistics that I think anybody would readily admit are a little bit flaky to begin with.
Well, some people live and die by them, but the point of the matter is you never know what someone's going to do.
Yeah,
You never know, hey, this guy who, according to XVM is like the doggiest of shits, is going to all of a sudden just kill everybody, have a
yeah,
mega game, get like 10,000 damage in a game, just ridiculous stuff. And having that one game is going to boost his stats like through the roof instantaneously. But, on average, he plays, he doesn't play that well. But every single person who loads into that game has the chance to just go off. You see it in professional sports. You see no-name guys go out there and throw perfect games, no-hitters. Now, it's usually the guys you expect. The guys who are going out there and hitting all the home runs. It's usually the same suspects. But every once in a while, you see a pitcher walk out there and hit a grand slam to win the game.
yeah.
Or you see...
Which may be the only home run he's ever hit ever in his career or ever will hit again.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change the fact that he won.
Yeah, and you'll see a guy go out in an NBA game and just drill like, a ton of threes, just not miss. And then he goes out the next day and just misses everything.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's just the randomness of competitive gaming. Or, well,
Yeah,
just
multi-
competition in general.
Yeah, well, it's the randomness of multiplayer games, so kind of in conclusion, at least from my end, Russian bias is very much something that I can conceptualize that people are unhappy about it when there's perception, but I think that thinking is fundamentally, and I'm going to use something I heard from a streamer recently. It said that thinking is just not robust. Your thinking is not robust in terms of saying what you're thinking, and while you have the right to your thought, the thought process you used to get there is wrong. People who blame Russian bias, I think are probably missing other facets of the conversation. And some of those, as we've alluded to, are just the nature of the game. When you encourage aggressive attacking playstyles, the tanks that were built to be aggressive attackers are going to do well. But sometimes, it's, well, maybe you shouldn't have shot the IS-4 on his, angled plate. Maybe you should have repositioned or worked with your team to flank it. There's always more to the story than, oh, well, the game designers are Russians, so they made all the Russian tanks OP.
Yeah, I generally agree. And I know I saw a comment on, I can't remember which video, but I did see it. I probably will respond to it as well. I think it was the last Ramble video where someone suggested that part of what we do in videos, not these videos in particular, but the other videos, more so what I do, I feel.
Like the reviews?
Well, no, just generally just the regular gameplay ones where I'm actually talking about gameplay. I'm not rambling on about something senseless and useless.
Okay, I'm trying to think the last time you made a video like that.
I know, it was years. a lot of people, or at least this person in particular, commented that it's a it's a good thing to hear kind of the stream of conscious that I had while I was playing. That can be valuable. Something we I think we should consider doing, and this is just totally off the cuff because I want to, and then I'll give my final opinion, and then we'll wrap this up. A video we might consider making is basically we take a game, and then we literally just talk about everything that happened, every decision, everything, thoughts on everything. But then also
I'm just gonna go and like say. I just want to say something real quick. I totally made a video about this called Rubber Duck Tanking.
Oh, I totally watched it but completely forgot it. So screw you.
Well, that's par for the course for you. I mean, and that's really an aside because I agree. It would be an interesting experience. And and the thing is that would even be, it almost would be beneficial for other people, for anybody.
Well, it'd be beneficial for me. I know. I'd learn a lot, just because I don't. A lot of times I make decisions that, to me, seem perfectly logical, but when I actually think about it, I'm like, maybe that wasn't. And that gives me an opportunity to basically debate with myself.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, like, if you have to sit there, like I said, if you have to sit there, like, if you record yourself playing, and you have to sit there and pretend you're talking to a rubber duck, and explain to the duck exactly why what you did for everything, I think a lot of people would find their play improving, if only because, as you sit there and quote it, explain it to the duck, you realize, wow, when I actually say what I was thinking out loud, or when I explain what I did, I sound like an idiot, or I sound like a genius. Because suddenly, like, that's how you make good decisions, is by more or less you're forcing yourself to be evaluative in a way that isn't natural to people.
Yeah, but then the second half of this video idea is, how do we approach the match? Like, when I load into the battle, what are those thoughts? Maybe the more overarching thoughts. So just something to think about. But I guess to wrap up, since you kind of have as well, I don't subscribe to Russian bias. I don't think it's a thing. But I've always been the type that I generally don't buy into. I don't know how to say it. Words escape. I generally don't buy into. I'm going to call them excuses. It's not. Complaining about Russian bias, I don't think, is making excuses sometimes. It's along the same line, but it's not that harsh of a word. I find that very harsh to say you're making excuses, right? Because that basically means that, because when you say, oh, you're making excuses, that means you were clearly wrong and you're just reaching for something, and that's not always the case. But I think when you pick something like Russian bias, which to me is a completely... it's not as you said, robust. It's not a robust way of thinking. You're reaching for the low-hanging fruit and trying to blame that for all your errors and things. But when you go back and look, and this is something I think I've come to the conclusion with because I've had to watch so many of my games back and forth, which I normally hate doing.
Funny how YouTube makes you do that.
I know. Like, I'll never watch one of our videos back. But that's one, because I already know what's in it. But two, I just, it's like I don't want to listen to myself,
Yeah.
Which is perfectly reasonable, I feel like. But it also, I have done it in the past, and it's helped me speak better and convey my thoughts maybe a little better, even though I don't do a very good job of it already. So, to me, Russian bias is just the fundamental lack of deeper introspection into what went wrong, why did you get killed, why did you get knocked out, why did your team lose, what could you have done better. Basically looking past, knowing the strengths of the machines you're facing and looking past some of the inherent powers that some tanks have, but it's not because the devs said we're going to make Russian tanks OP. Russian bias kind of assumes conscious decision. And I don't think that's a thing. I think it's just, this is the way these games have to be made. And
Yeah, and if I can cut in real quick, something that's kind of the way you're talking about this makes a lot of sense, and I think one of the kind of factoids worth bringing up is Russian bias in a lot of ways sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory. Like, the guys are out there
yeah, I'd
saying,
agree.
oh, 9/11 is an inside job, that there's the explanation is something, you know, something out there that's on a grander scale than, than I think it in reality would actually kind of indicate. As you said, like if you go back and if you can go back to if you can record every game you play, go back and watch the entire game end to end, and sit there and be intellectually honest, watch through the whole thing and say I played absolutely perfectly.
You need to
A,
learn more
you're
about the game.
Yeah, you either need to learn more about the game or you are literally a god, and we should be watching your videos.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess just to finally wrap up after all these tangents I like going down when I
No,
say I'm wrapping up. Uh, Russian bias, in my opinion and in yours, Phil, is not a thing. It's honestly, it's honestly just the way things are made because that's the way they need to be made. It's just design philosophy of machines, especially in World War II. You kind of see this whole Russian bias thing getting thrown on its head now in the later ranks of War Thunder ground forces.
well, I remember there was a big. I mean, I guess to call it anything but a pretty big nasty fight in I think the was it the BR video? It was in one of our videos recently. We had a what I would term a pretty nasty fight over people saying, oh, you're just one of these complainers. And the thing is that now even the Russians are getting on it saying, oh, we've been nerfed to hell, which is something the Germans have been saying for a very long time.
Well, yeah, people are always going to jump. I think there's a lot of people, and when I was making that video, I was kind of worried about the kickback, but I decided that it wasn't worth worrying about because for various reasons that I won't go into now. But I mean, there's people who go out there and try and defend the tank that they love very dearly, and that's understandable. I love the T-95, but it's kind of shit in War Thunder.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you love the T-95 to pieces. Fact
But
is that the
it's not
tank
very
is
good.
not performing as good as it could be.
It's just in reality, it's not as good. In World of Tanks, it's good, but in War Thunder, it's not. The people love to death their IS-2, and then they say that, oh no, you can't, why, or their IS-3, and they say, oh no, our IS-3s are actually working now because we're killing everybody and taking billions of hits, and absolutely annihilating these tanks. No, this is how it's meant to be. There's no evidence that that's how it's meant to be, and quite frankly,
there's not a lot of evidence at all because
yeah,
sadly a lot of these tanks never really saw a lot of service.
well, and or never saw each other. So I mean, people are always going to defend almost like what they're having fun with, and the whole. But I think and there's, it's just like anything, politics, you name it. There's always nut jobs on either side, and I don't feel bad about calling people who get that intense about stuff nut jobs, because at some point you do become a nut job. It's more so that when you find that the people in the middle, like the more sane, I guess, logical people, what I took away from that video was my thoughts are echoed, right? Because the common strand amongst people who made well thought out, responses that weren't profane laced or didn't clearly come from a lack of knowledge, not a lack of intelligence, but maybe just a lack of knowledge or a lack of devoted thought. The people who did devote thought to the issue, I valued their opinions so much more, and a lot of them just echoed what I had said. So it kind of vindicated me, validated my own thoughts and opinions, because that video really was just me testing the waters to some degree. But anyway, so I don't think Russian bias is a thing. This was a very long-winded discussion about tank design and things like that. Phil, what are your thoughts?
Again, Russian bias ain't a thing. It's more closer to a conspiracy theory than anything in reality.
Yeah, it's easy to grasp onto because it's there, but it's not the reason you lose games. It very rarely is.
Yeah.
The reason is that it's honestly just that the Russian tanks are built for this. And as we expand the tanks in War Thunder and as we add other nationalities, I think we'll see a decline of this more into the World of Tanks area of the universe, where a good machine is having a couple win percentage points higher, like 52% win rate on this machine rather than global 48. That's what I think ultimately War Thunder needs to get to, is a point where a average Joe player will win 50% of his games in all of his machines. Basically, it comes down to how you play them and how you execute strategies with that machine. The Leo, for example, you flank, you do things. I'm gonna go down another tangent. I don't really want to. So maybe that's a subject for another video. But anyway,
I was saying we could write a book on some of these.
we honestly, if we wanted to, we could turn. There's so many videos that are going to spin off these ramble videos, which is kind of what I like. So I guess
it makes our jobs easier. We don't have to be creative anymore. We can just say, well, while we were talking about that, here's this other thing that people are pissed about. Let's talk about that for a bit.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess let's wrap up. Okay. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope this was entertaining. I hope it maybe catalyzed some thoughts, or maybe led you to think about what we said and maybe take it a step farther. And I 100% encourage everyone who watches this video to comment down below and say if you disagree or not. Do you disagree with our points? Do you disagree with our logic? And spell out why. Because a lot of times my opinion can be changed. I know Phil, I'm sure yours can as well, where you may think of something we didn't think of, which takes us down a new train of thought, which provides contradiction to something we already thought of. It's how knowledge is sort of generated and supported, is by questioning. So feel free to ask questions. Also, feel free to suggest another topic for another ramble. We want to make this a weekly thing. We want it to be viewer driven. So we need viewers to leave us thoughts. Leave us, hey, this is something I would really like to hear a ramble about. Because that's really what this is. This is guided rambling. I've decided that's the name for the series, Guided Rambles. But, yeah. So I want to thank you guys for watching. I've been Corny Swiss.
I'm Corny Phil.
And we'll see you next time.